subqueries within MySQL. So a subquery are queries nested within other queries, and sometimes subqueries are referred to as nested queries. So we can see in the example here, we have two select statements within one query. So we have select ID start time from screenings, where film ID is in, select ID from films, where length min is greater than 120. So we have a subquery here. We have the select ID from films where length min is greater than 120, and this is referred to as the inner query. And then we have the outer query, which is select ID start time from screenings where film ID is in the inner query. So subqueries can be used in a select, insert, update or delete query, but in this section we're just going to be looking at subqueries within select statements. And the nested query or inner query can be in the where clause of a select statement, or it can come after the from in a select statement. And there are two types of subquery. There's non-correlated subqueries and there's correlated subqueries. So in non-correlated subqueries, the inner query can run independently of the outer query. So if we have a look at this example again, we have our inner query, which is select ID from films where length min is greater than 120, and then we have our outer query, which is select ID start time from screenings where film ID is in the inner query. So if we look at the inner query, select ID from films where length min is greater than 120, we can actually run this independently of the outer query. So we don't need the outer query for us to be able to run this inner query. And in non-correlated subqueries, the inner query runs first and it only runs once, and it produces a set of results which are then used by the outer query. So this inner query select ID from films where length min is greater than 120 is going to produce a set of results. It's going to return a set of IDs where the film's length is greater than 120 minutes. And then the outer query is going to take this result and it's going to return the ID and the start time from screenings where the film ID is in the results from the inner query. But for correlated subqueries, the inner query can't run independently of the outer query, and that's because the inner query is using data from the outer query. So if we have a look at the example here, in the outer query we have select screening ID, customer ID from bookings B. So we're selecting two columns from the bookings table in the outer query, and then in the inner query we're saying select count seat ID from the reserved seat table where booking ID is equal to b.id. So we're referring to the bookings table in the outer query within our inner query. So if we run this inner query independently of the outer query, it's actually going to return an error because it's not going to know what b.id is, because b.id only makes sense if we've got the outer query. And in correlated subqueries, the inner query runs for every row in the outer query. So the outer query here is going to select screening ID and customer ID from the bookings table. So it's going to return a lot of rows, a row for each screening ID and customer ID in the bookings table. And then the inner query is going to run for every single row that the outer query returns. So in a correlated subquery, the inner query runs multiple times. So now we know the basics of subqueries. Let's take a look at